Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 11th Annual Wisconsin Science Festival and the 8th time the Science Festival has intersected with a book festival. My name is Laura Heisler. I'm the co-founder and director of the Wisconsin Science Festival, and I want to start out by thanking all of the many sponsors who make the Science Festival possible, along with the Madison Public Library and the Madison Public Library Foundation, which sponsors the Wisconsin Book Festival. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to go through a couple of housekeeping notes. Jordan will be taking questions with about 10 or 15 minutes to go before we have to end this session. If you do have a question, we're going to ask you to line up at the microphone that you see in the middle of the room rather than pass the mic to you. That's just an accommodation we're making for COVID. We may not be able to get to all of your questions, so I apologize in advance for that. We do need to end with 10 minutes to go so we can get ready for the next book talk, which is Larry Olmsted with his book Fans. Jordan will be sticking around. Books are for sale outside to my left, and Jordan will be sticking around and signing them. So I want to encourage you to, if you don't get your question answered, buy a book and talk to him while he signs your book. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend Jordan Ellenberg. Jordan grew up in Potomac, Maryland, the child of two statisticians, and excelled in math from an early age, winning all kinds of gold medals, silver, just to keep things interesting. He went to college at Harvard, got a master's degree in fiction writing from Johns Hopkins, and then decided to go back to Harvard to get his PhD in math. After graduate school, he's a postdoc at Princeton, and in 2004, he joined the faculty at UW-Madison, where he is now the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Mathematics. His accolades are too many to read here because you do want to hear from him. He has been writing for a general audience about math for more than 15 years, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Wired, The Believer, and the Boston Globe, and he is the author of Do the Math column in Slate. His Wired feature story on compressed sensing appeared in the Best Writing on Mathematics 2011 anthology, and his novel The Grasshopper King was a finalist for the 2004 New York Public Library Young Lions Fiction Award. Please join me in welcoming Jordan Ellenberg.
Hi, everybody. Well, thanks so much. And this is, even though this book came out in May, this is my very first in-person event. So thank you to Laura. And it's so great that the Wisconsin Book and Science Festival has been able to put this together in person. It's great to see half of many familiar faces today. And so, yeah, I look back at the announcement for the talk, and boy, the little paragraph I gave covers a lot. I mean, it's a long book and there's a lot of stuff in it. Let me sort of show you. This is sort of a map of some of the stuff that's in the book. I drew this in the frontispiece. It's supposed to be like, when you read like The Hobbit and there's like the map of like the land and like all the different creatures that are in the different places and how you get from here to there. It's like that. So I'm not going to cover all of this in the next 35 minutes. I'm going to cover some stuff on the upper right and some stuff sort of from the middle. But if you have any questions about any of these things that I don't talk about today, like feel free to talk after. And certainly one of the features of this subject, the subject of geometry, is that everything is connected to everything else. It was actually hard to keep the book small when there were so many pathways to follow. And this is just a picture of some of them. So let me start, because in math, we always start with a problem, with two puzzles. Here's the first one, a very topical one. What you are looking at is two proposed maps for the 99 assembly districts of the state of Wisconsin. These are the districts that determine our legislatures who make a lot of our laws. I couldn't get them in the same format, sorry, because they're from two different sources. One of them, this one on the left, shows only the assembly maps. The one on the right, it's a little harder to read because it shows the Senate districts and the assembly districts, but the purple lines are delineating the assembly districts. So suppose somebody slapped both of these in front of you and was like, well, which one is a fair map? Okay, I think you'll agree it's hard to see with the naked eye, right? Unless I have some real experts in the room. So that's a puzzle. And you're not allowed to ask who made them, by the way. That's cheating. Okay. Here's another puzzle. What is this list? Okay. And I'm going to sort of talk about the sort of geometric line that joins both of these puzzles and hopefully to some extent answers them. But that starts neither with a list of strange looking words or names or with maps of Wisconsin, but with this fellow who is I know you can't really read this. I just want you to be able to read the headline, which says Mosquito Man Coming. This is Sir Ronald Ross, the winner of the second ever Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1902. And the reason he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine, and also the reason he earned the sobriquet Mosquito Man, is because he was the person who discovered that malaria was spread by the bite of the Anopheles mosquito, an absolutely huge development in public health. And he was a very interesting character. I wrote a lot about him in this book, partly because he was this super famous doctor who always felt underappreciated, was constantly haranguing people for not giving him enough honors and prizes, even though he had 1 million honors and prizes. And on some level, it was because he never really wanted to be a doctor at all. There were two things he really valued. One was poetry, the other was mathematics. And so an event I write about in the book is that in 1904, he comes to St. Louis for this kind of great International Convention of Science, part of the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904, this kind of incredible world event. And he comes to give this talk. He's talking about the problem of disease eradication. And again, you guys want to talk about COVID and the problem of disease eradication? There's a lot about that in the book, super interesting. I'm not going to do it today, but we can talk after. But it connects to this. And this picture, which Ross presented in 1904, was his kind of diagram of a wandering mosquito. He said, you clear all the mosquitoes out of some area, and you want to know how long it's going to take for them to get back. How long is it going to take for the mosquitoes from elsewhere to sort of flow back into this area that you laboriously cleared? Well, that has to do with how far a mosquito travels in a given amount of time. Maybe that doesn't seem so hard, right? You can sort of test a mosquito, see how fast it can go, and then say, I guess it can go that far per day. So you know how far it'll go in a week or 2 weeks or something like that. But no, it's more complicated than that, because mosquitoes, as you may know, they're not like goal-oriented, right? The mosquito is not going to pick a direction and just like focus like a laser, like fly that direction at a top speed. No, the mosquito kind of meander around like this. And this is the picture. He said, what if the mosquito starts from a random point, this point marked P in the middle, and just each day kind of chooses a random direction to go. Maybe it flies the same distance each day, but at a randomly chosen direction. And in this picture, he's like, well, look, it probably is going to kind of meander and not go the same direction every day and kind of cancel itself out and wind up maybe like not that far from its original destination. So he was kind of presenting an optimistic case that maybe the diffusion of the mosquitoes would not be so fast as you might originally fear. And maybe these eradication techniques would be more effective than you might initially think. But he did not have what he really wanted to do. And the problem he presented to the people at the convention was he wanted to sort of mathematicize and make a model and say, like, okay, I really want to estimate how far this randomly traveling mosquito will end up from its starting place on average. And this he did not quite have enough math to do. And he writes in his memoirs very proudly about how all the doctors expected him to give a medical talk, and instead he gave a talk about math, and they were all completely confused and nobody understood a word he said. I mean, honestly, he was a difficult character. Let's just say that. He was very proud of how much he confused everyone. Real mathematicians are hopefully not like that. Anyway, he wrote to Carl Pearson. He wrote to the right person. He wrote to sort of this great British statistician who, nowadays we would just like put this on Twitter or something. But in those days, he wrote a letter to Nature, which is sort of the premier scientific journal. And it's in the letters column, just people are like, I'm wondering about something. And Pearson, again, you don't have to read all these words, but Pearson writes a letter posing Ross's problem for him, removing all mention of mosquitoes, and also, to Ross's great annoyance, removing all mention of Ross. So they were both a bit salty about this. But the important thing about this letter is that Pearson, in this letter, coins the word that mathematicians use to describe this kind of process even today, a random walk. He puts it in terms of a person walking instead of a mosquito flying. But this idea of the random walk, of what happens if you move a certain way, but at each step, your choice of which way to move is random, determined by chance. What actually happens to you over a long period of time? That's like I mean, we have like many people in the math department in Wisconsin who like this is like literally what they study like all day, every day. It's an entire field of mathematics. And it starts here. Well, actually, and it's a story I tell in the book at great length. It starts here, but actually it starts all around the world at the same time. Something's in the air around 1904, 1905, 1906, where people all over the world are thinking about this same problem in sort of the same way and not really aware of each other, because again, no Twitter. So I'm not going to tell all of these stories. I'm not going to talk about Einstein. I'm not going to talk about Louis Bachelier and the invention of mathematical finance, but let me at least say a word about Andrei Alexeyevich Markov, because the other thing we call a random walk all the time is a Markov chain or a Markov process. And so now you know these sort of buzzwords that if you hear them said, if you hear somebody say random walk or you hear somebody say Markov process, you'll know what they're talking about. Markov, short talk, long story. I'm not going to tell the whole story of how he was trying to like win this crazy theoretical, this crazy sort of theological argument with his arch rival mathematician who was also a sort of former theologian about whether Russian orthodoxy was true. Long story. But he does independently develop the theory of the random walk. Let me put it in Mosquito terms for you. Here's a drastic oversimplification. He was like, let's study what happens. Suppose the mosquito doesn't have a whole field to wander around in. Suppose there's only 2 bogs that the mosquito can live in. And this diagram depicts the way chance works. The mosquito likes bog 0. At any given moment, if the mosquito is there, the mosquito is 90% likely to stay there. But there's a 10% chance the mosquito hops over to bog 1. And similarly, if the mosquito is in bog 1, maybe bog 1 is not quite as nice. There's a 20% chance the mosquito hops over to back to bog 0, and an 80% chance the mosquito stays put. And you can imagine asking, what would it look like if we just tracked the mosquito for a long time? Where would it typically be? How much time would it spend in each bog? The answers to these questions and more complicated questions are not easy, but they're exactly the questions that Markov took it upon himself to understand and create an entire theory of, which we now call the theory of Markov chains or Markov processes. But there's sort of an interesting wrinkle because Markov, by the way, was mostly not interested in applied things at all. He would never have said this about the mosquitoes. And in fact, when he found out there were people elsewhere in Europe working on this for applied reasons, he was like, I don't know if that sound comes through for the math, but he was a dismissive puff of air. But he did later in life write a very interesting paper where he's like, okay, there's one application that's important enough that even I'm willing to study it. And that was the poetry of Pushkin, which every Russian super cares about. And so this is the Markov chain he made out of Eugene Onegin, Pushkin's great verse poem. And he said, what if you just treat this like a hopping mosquito and say every time there's a consonant, what's the chance that the next letter is a consonant? Not very high. Mostly a consonant is followed by a vowel, but it's even rarer for a vowel to be followed by a vowel. And so he sort of, this is sort of like a fingerprint of this particular poet's style. A very, very limited aspect of his style, like how much he liked to follow a vowel by a vowel. But he showed that you could actually, he took 2 texts. And by the way, no computers, right? He was like laboriously like writing out these characters by hand and counting. That Pushkin and a Russian novelist, Aksakov, were completely distinguishable. These numbers are just different. And you could distinguish their styles simply by the patterns of consonants and vowels, the Markov chain of sounds. So this has become like a really influential way of thinking about language. I know it seems really dumb, but bear with me. Let's dress this up a little bit. Once we have computers, we don't have to say, okay, if you're a consonant, what's the chance the next thing is a vowel? We could say, if you're a B, what's the chance that the next letter is an A? You can sort of, it would be a little bigger of a thing to draw. You can even do more. Okay, let me draw another one of my pictures. A pair of 2 letters in sequence is called a bigram. And we could say, okay, look at some sequence of English text and say, for each bigram, let's take AB. And what's the next bigram in my text? Now, by the way, I mean like, So for instance, if this was our text, the name of the best Genesis album, if anybody has opinions about that, then the first bigram is AB, and the second bigram is BA. And the third bigram is AC, right? So they overlap. So what that means is that AB, it can't be followed by AA, because the second letter of my bigram has to be the first letter of the next bigram, whose second letter has to be the first letter of the following bigram, et cetera. So from AB, you can only go to BA, BB, BC, and then all the other Bs. But then from BA, you have to go back to something that starts with A. So of course, I'm not going to draw all 676 possible. Anybody else compute that? All 676 bigrams on here, nor all the connections between them. But this is a tiny part of this graph. And you could, if you wanted to, take some large passage of English text and figure out all these percentages. You see it AB? What percentage of the time is the next bigram BA? What percentage of the time is it BB? What percentage of the time is it BC? And when I say you could do that, I mean, of course, people do that. Peter Norvig from Google has a wonderful page about this with like data that you can download and find out like all this information about bigrams. And then you can do something kind of cool, which is that instead of just using it as a way to study language, you can use it as a way to produce language, or at least something that looks kind of like language. You can say, okay, start with AB, and now we have a rule that says there's a this much chance you go to BA, there's a this much chance you go to BB, there's a this much chance you go to BC. Okay, so do that. Jump to the next bigram. Now jump to the third one. Now jump to the fourth one. What you're going to produce is a sequence of bigrams. Maybe it's AB, BA, AC, CA, AB, which is going to look like some sequence of text. Again, this seems like a really weird idea to try to produce text randomly. It's an idea that I think was first developed, at least as far as I know, in a famous paper of Claude Shannon, the creator of information theory, which features this beautiful phrase, in nois last way kratic for bears grossed pondinum of demonsters of the reptigen is rectio actina of Cray. And this is text produced exactly by the mechanism that I just showed you, successive bigrams. And I love looking at stuff like this because it's not English, but it has something in common with English, doesn't it? There's something Englishy about it, this kind of property of which bigrams are likely to follow which other bigrams captures something about English. And I promise you that if you had done the same thing, trained on Spanish text, and I showed you that, you would be able to tell which one was English and which one was Spanish, even though they weren't real words. So this kind of automated language production is, I mean, again, we could tell a whole story if you know about GPT-3 and like other kind of language production AI systems. I mean, they all have random walks under the hood. And now, where am I on time? 3:17, perfect, because I'm ready to answer the first puzzle. I had a little fun with this. I love baby names. I'm writing a paper with a couple of my colleagues in the statistics department about analysis of baby names over time. There's great databases of baby names given, broken down by year in the US. And so I use as my source baby names given to babies in the US in different years. And this is what you get. Oh, I should have said, the longer your strings of letters. So if you use bigrams, you get a certain Englishy texture. If you use trigrams, it feels more Englishy. If you use pentagrams, 5-letter strings, you get even more fealty. And here's what you get. The first three are built on names given in 1971, the year of my birth. If you do pentagrams, you get something that's so close to the source text that you're basically just repeating things that are in the database, like actual names like Adam and Susan and Kelsey. Some of them are kind of mixed up names. Bigrams, I think those are kind of cool actually, but they're a little bit farther from real names being given. And at least for the name data set, I found that using 3-letter strings, that's the sort of the fun place to be, in this uncanny valley where they really feel like names that could be real, but they're mostly not. And so now you see the answer to puzzle 1. Those phrases, Kendi, Jean, Abby, Flurry, Mara, etc., are names that are produced by a random walk that are in some sense supposed to sound like names that a baby might have been given in 1971, which maybe they kind of are. But you can really see this if you do the same thing trained on 2017 babies and 1917 babies, because they really do have the feeling, right? Don't you feel like all of you guys could have told you maybe I should have done this. If I didn't label them and said, which one is supposed to sound like names babies get in 2017? Like Luxton? There probably is some kid out there named Luxton, right? In one of your preschools, like that's gotta be. But also maybe not, right? But it has the right feeling. Or Naviel, Corby is a real name, right? Is that a name people have? I feel like it is, okay. And 1917, also, those names really sound like old-timey names. So this random walk process really is capturing something. It's capturing something. It's not reproducing what we do, but it's reproducing some stylistic features of what we do. Okay, ready for a wrenching shift? But it's really the same. We're still on random walks secretly. Okay, let me bring back our great state of Wisconsin. And here you're looking at, these are the current assembly maps, which if you've ever heard me talk about this, you know I don't like. So you know I don't like these. But let me just, in the last 15 minutes that we have together, give a brief description of this very much in the news right now topic of redistricting and gerrymandering, because we are in the process right now of choosing new lines, of choosing new boundaries for the 99 assembly districts. We have to, because the old districts no longer have anything like the same population. Some of these districts have grown in population, like the one you're sitting in right now, Assembly District 77. Some of them have shrunk. Some of those are in Milwaukee, some are up north. But the population growth has not been uniform in this state by any means. So the issue is that it turns out, we now know that the way you draw those lines has a huge effect on who gets elected to the legislature. And one reason I was excited to write about this stuff in this book is because I've written a lot about this stuff in newspapers. In the newspaper, you get what, like 1,000 words? You can say some stuff, and it does force you to focus and sort of focus on the most important thing, but it doesn't really allow you to tell the whole story. It doesn't really allow you to get all the nuances. On the other hand, I didn't want to write a whole book about this stuff because it's a little depressing in a way. I didn't want to spend all my time on that, and it's maybe more than I wanted to do. So writing a book like this one, I'm sort of gesturing at it because it's around here somewhere. Oh, there's one over there. There's probably about 70 pages at the end of this book where I really feel like I tell this story about as well as I can tell it. And I just want to give you a sense of how mathematicians and political scientists today would address this question of what does it mean for a map to be fair? And I'm going to close, I think, by sort of emphasizing that this question is in many ways still not really settled. So let me say what I don't mean. Here's a very popular tweet that went around. This one was from Rachel Maddow, but you can sort of see different versions of it everywhere. It says, something went really wrong in Wisconsin. This is from the 2018 election because many more people voted for Democrats than for Republicans for state assembly. This is not governor votes. These are like votes for state assembly reps. And yet, almost all of the seats were won by Republicans. This is a perfect example of something that superficially seems extremely damning, but it's kind of meaningless. So just to comment, 2018, as you may remember, was a banner year for Democrats in this state and around the country. So much so that there were many Democratic-leaning assembly seats where Republicans simply did not run a candidate. All over the state. I didn't write down the exact number, but I think it was like 17 or 18. So that's a lot of districts with a lot of population. And that population does include like a fair number of Republicans, right? Even in our predominantly Democratic district, there are Republicans who ordinarily would vote. They did vote for governor. They did vote for Senate, but they did not vote for assembly because there was not a Republican candidate. So I think this statistic that you'll often see bandied about, you saw it in 2020, and I'm sure you're going to see it in 2022, of what is the total popular vote for Democrats and Republicans in the assembly, by itself is not very meaningful unless you know something about were there actually Democrats and Republicans in each race. I think it's okay for Congress because basically every congressional district of the US House does have a candidate for both parties. There's very few uncontested races, but that is not true in the Wisconsin Assembly. So that's kind of myth one I want to puncture, that you should sort of focus on things like this. If I ever meet Rachel Maddow, I'll bring this up with her. The other myth I want to say is that, which a lot of people think, is that what gerrymandering is drawing weirdly shaped districts to accomplish your goals. If you look back at the assembly districts we have, they don't actually look that weird, do they? They're not that snaky or octopus-like, or I mean, they just kind of look like regular-looking blobs mostly. And here we're really seeing the effect of technology, because I think it probably is the case that it used to be that if you wanted to make districts that really helped your party out, you kind of had to make them funnily shaped. But now, because it's pretty easy on a computer to be like, let me try 10,000 different things in a half a second, it's pretty easy to say, hey, I want the districts to be roughly nicely shaped and to accomplish my partisan goals. And you can definitely do that. And I don't mean to say this hypothetically, that is indeed what was done in 2011 in a locked, probably air pressurized chamber that no one was allowed to see, that gave us the Act 43 maps that we have today. So let me show you a picture of what the gerrymandering in this state actually looks like. So on the left, and I want to thank Malia Jones from the Applied Population Lab, whose lab made these awesome pictures. So on the left, you're seeing the maps that we had in force in this state between 2002 and 2010. These were drawn by a court because it was another era of divided government, but the legislature and the governor couldn't agree on a map. On the right, you have the current assembly district. Anybody notice a striking difference between these two? Yeah, somebody pointed out that, right, so there's no 99 in the other one. So they do shift the numbers around a lot. But I kind of heard somebody mutter it. There's this nice vertical line down the middle of this chart. And if you, which is, yes, as somebody said, it's a county line. So if you know Wisconsin geography really well, who knows what line that is? That is exactly, that is the Waukesha-Milwaukee County line. And that is what we call in the redistricting business a natural political boundary. It's not just a county line. If you have ever like driven to a Brewers game like a couple months before an election, I mean, you can see the sign snap from red to blue as you cross from Milwaukee. As you cross from Waukesha into Milwaukee. It is a real difference, and it is one of the sort of traditional districting criteria that those county lines, representing as they do natural political boundaries, should be respected by the districts. And you'll notice that this court-drawn map largely does that. Like many of the districts terminate where Milwaukee County terminates. The new districts do not. Why would that be? Well, it's because the goal in drawing these districts was to take a certain number of Milwaukee County voters, these folks in Tosa and West Allis who are like majority Democrats, and mix them in with enough Waukesha and Brookfield folks to make those districts safely Republican. But then leaving not that many districts wholly within Milwaukee County, which would be Democratic districts. So they are drawn precisely to dilute the power of Milwaukee County's Democratic voters. But they look pretty nice, don't they? They don't look weird. They're just kind of like rectangles. So I just want to emphasize that this is the way gerrymandering looks now, and it is not easy to see by the naked eye the way it might have been 50 or even 30 years ago. Okay, I hope I didn't make this sound too hopeless. So what are we going to do now? What are we going to do if we can't look at the map and see what's fair or unfair? Well, let me state a kind of pretty plausible principle, because there's a huge amount of argument, and I cover it in the book, what counts as fair. Here's a principle I think most people can agree to, that maybe fair means the outcome is sort of what it would be if the people actually drawing the maps hadn't been, oh, I don't know, like paid operatives of one political party, like working in a locked room. I mean, I'm just to throw a sort of ridiculous hypothetical out there. Like, what if instead of that, some party, which was, sorry, I shouldn't say party, but some group of people who were, I mean, nobody's perfectly impartial, but who were less partial, who were less directly incentivized to achieve a certain outcome by the drawing of the maps. Okay, well, this is great to say, but it's kind of one of these like difficult counterfactuals. Okay, so it wasn't drawn by people without partisan intent. And it's not clear there is a political actor in the state who doesn't have partisan intent, right? If we gave it to the governor to do, the governor also has partisan intent, right? I mean, maybe we could have an independent commission the way some states do, but Wisconsin doesn't really have a mechanism for setting something like that up. So what's the alternative? Here's where we come down. Okay, we don't have people without partisan intent. But we do have other entities that can draw lines without partisan intent, namely machines. And the machine doesn't have a preference between Democrats and Republicans unless you give it one. So this is what we do now. And let me draw an extremely misleading cartoon for you of how this process looks. We somehow want to do the following. We want to say, hey, computer, show me a random map of Wisconsin. Show me a random way to divide Wisconsin into 99 assembly districts. That sounds like the kind of thing you can ask a computer to do. What's the problem? There are a lot of ways to do it. And I mean a lot. Like a computer cannot search them all a lot. So the question is, how can we possibly search this unimaginably huge landscape of possible ways to divide Wisconsin into maps without even being able to list them all because there's too many and like the sun would wink out and et cetera, it's impossible. And the answer is, again, our friend, the random walk. So here's my misleading picture. This is like the sort of world of all possible assembly maps. Every map we know about is in here. There's like the 2002 map, the People's Commission map that the Governor's Commission has drawn, the current map. And I drew the current map sort of way out on the edge of space to indicate that there's something like very weird about it. It's like extremely different from the rest in terms of how much it favors Republicans. And if you wanted to draw a random map, one thing you could do is just start from someplace and do a random walk. Start from a certain map, change the map a little bit in some way, chosen a random, now choose another random way to change it. Like literally, move a ward, voting ward from the boundary of one district to the boundary of an adjoining district. And just keep on doing that for a long time. You're taking a random walk throughout this space, and one might hope that just as the Mosquito eventually kind of can be just about anywhere, sort of at random, or just as in some long string of English text, you're eventually going to encounter every letter, you may hope that you get something like a randomly drawn map from this sample if you do a random walk through this thing that I've drawn as a nicely shaped blob, but is in fact some kind of like gigantic dimensional impossible to encompass space. And the genius of the Markov process is that it's really good at exploring spaces we can't even begin to describe. I know that sounds magical, but it really works in practice. So let me show you what this looks like. This is a slide from a paper that came out in 2017 by some of my colleagues at Duke. What they did is they used this random walk to construct about 16,000 possible districting maps of Wisconsin. And they said, for each of these maps, let's look back at the data of how each precinct voted in 2012 and how many assembly seats would each party have won. And the first thing I want to show you is it's not constant. There's no one answer to, if the map were drawn at random, how many seats would Democrats have won, because that's the nature of randomness, right? There's some wiggle room. I mean, some maps are one way, some maps are another way. So you get something that looks like, sort of like the fabled like bell curve, right? But it's clearly peaked at around 55. So what this is saying is that, and actually if you put together the seats where, or sorry, Republicans winning 55, that's what this indicates. So if you add together the cases where Republicans win 54, Republicans win 55, or Republicans win 56 in the 2012 election, that's actually already about half of all the maps that they found at random. So there's a 50% chance just of getting that. This little arrow where it says WI, that's the map we actually have. So what this diagram is there to show you, where the Republicans won 60 seats. So what this is there to show you is that the map we actually have, the Act 43 map enacted in 2011, it doesn't look anything like a map drawn at random. It's more Republican friendly than all but a tiny fraction of the randomly selected maps. And this is the best tool we have at present, I think, to say something about what we mean by fair. That we're able to actually pretty accurately estimate that in the universe of all possible maps, the one that we have is drastically oriented towards Republicans. Okay, so we're just about at the end of our time, so I am going to show you a little bit. I promised on Twitter that I have some rip from the headlines new slides. So let me show you some data about the two maps I drew for you. And the first one, the one on the left, was the fourth version of the assembly, or sorry, the second version of the assembly map drawn by the People's Commission. The one on the right is the new map drawn by the state legislature. And they look pretty different. They didn't look that different to the naked eye when I showed you the slides at the beginning, but they look pretty different on this metric. And I actually don't love these like letter grades. I feel like it's better to actually like look at the data. So let me sort of zoom in. But I emphasize this is from the Princeton gerrymandering project, their project called Plan Score, which has ratings like this for like every state. So I highly recommend going and looking at it. I should have put the URL on here. But let me just zero in to show you what this says. This is a picture. Now they can make 1 million maps. They're not just doing 16,000, which is very similar, showing you that given the current patterns of Democratic and Republican voting, which, as you know, is like in terms of population, like very evenly split between the two parties here in Wisconsin, that in their sample of random maps, the most common outcome was Democrats winning, I think that's 45 seats. So it's actually pretty similar to the 2012 patterns. Things have not changed that much. With the bulk of maps giving Democrats, I don't know, 44, 45, 46 seats. The current map submitted by the legislature would give Democrats just 40 seats. And you can see that that's absolutely an outlier, way outside the reasonable range of maps that might have been drawn by an impartial actor. But I want to make a comment, which is that this People's Commission map is also actually pretty far from the mean in the other direction. It's definitely not as bad. Like if you look at sort of where it is in the distribution, I would call it unusually Democratic leaning, but I wouldn't call it extravagantly, extraordinarily, offensively Republican leaning the way that the legislative map is. So I think just to sort of finish here, this slide raises a really interesting question of what we truly mean by fair, because I do want to emphasize that what this slide is showing you is that given the geographic pattern of where voters live in this state, if a computer that is completely nonpartisan draws the districts by chance, trying to keep them like, geographically contiguous and all this stuff, it is still the case that almost all of the time in a 50-50 state, the Republicans are going to have the majority in the assembly. That is what they will tell you as an explanation for the reason that the assembly looks the way it looks. And they will say that because as a statement of fact, that is true. What's not true is that they would have the same kind of overwhelming majorities that they have now. And the random walk really gives us the tool to assess this. But I think it's an interesting philosophical question that as a mathematician, I'm not here to answer. Do you think fair means that something like this, where the Democrats would be competitive to get 50 seats if they got 50% of the vote? Or do you think it means the map looks like it would look if it were drawn by an impartial actor, in which case I think it is fair to say that the Republicans would have an advantage on seats, even when the vote was split 50-50 because of where people live. I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to leave it to you, and I'm just going to close on this slide again in case people want to ask about anything else on here, and I'll take questions. Thank you guys so much.
So if you were to talk to people that see more data, or data.
That one's on.
Try again. Oh, much better. If you were to talk to a preacher, they'd say they see the hand of God in everything. If you talk to a musician, they say they see music in everything. Talk to a poet, they say you see poetry in everything. Talk to a humanist, they see humanity in everything. Talk to you, you see math in everything. You're the math guy. Where's the pattern here?
I mean, I'm trying to understand if that question was aggressive or not. I mean, if you mean like, am I sort of conditioned to sort of like see math in lots of places and perhaps underrate the other aspects? I mean, that's possibly true. I guess what I'd say to that is that, first of all, in the book, I think I really do. I think one of the sort of benefits of being mathematically trained and writing about this stuff is not just that you see the math and everything, but also that you see the limits of where the math is. And I really do in the book sort of try to do that, especially with political issues like this, to sort of emphasize when I write about what courts have said about this, that there are math issues and there's legal issues and they're intertwined, but you can't solve this kind of problem just with math. So I want to emphasize that. The other thing I'd say is, and just to sort of pitch things like the Science Festival as a whole, one of the great things about the university, being in a gigantic university is like this, is that there is an expert in everything. And so somebody who wants to see the math in something knows they can come talk to me. And if I want to go see the poetry in something, I know the poets and the poetry professors I can talk to. My daughter challenged me the other day because I was just giving a sales pitch. I've become very boring. I say this to my own kids about how great it is to be part of a big university. Because an expert in everything. My daughter was like, oh yeah, like what about potatoes? And then I found the potato guy. We 100% have a potato professor. He seems really cool. Okay, so and if you want somebody who sees the potatoes and everything, I now know who to go find.
Okay. First of all, I want to point out the flooring in the middle here has amazing shape. So people should take a peek sometime. It's all tessellated. Thank you for bringing math to people. I mean, those of us who do math, we struggle to have a common ground with people. So I appreciate that. I want to ask, random factors into so much of what you want to communicate. And I think it's really hard to understand it. And I wonder if you can share some insights about, first of all, why do people have such a difficult time understanding randomness if we are the product of randomness? And are there some limits? Like, is random perhaps like a kind of mathematical ideal, but maybe things aren't so random all the time? Can you share you've thought a lot about randomness and it's really important. Can you share some thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that it's conceptually difficult. And in fact, I mean, you can see that just in the history of mathematics, that the theory of probability comes very late. I mean, mathematics has been like chugging along for like 2,000 years before there's anything you would call a mathematical theory of probability. Before that time, before like the 1600s or so, people are like, well, if it's chance, it doesn't have to do with mathematics, right? Mathematics is the science of the certain. So I think there's no question it's an inherently difficult concept, and for people to reason probabilistically is hard. In fact, I'll be here on November 2nd, I think. I'll be here in this very room, and I'm supposed to sort of give a 5-minute squib. I mean, we're sort of having like a big COVID panel and talking about like, why is it hard for people to take in probabilistic information when that's so important, right? Whereas I think, so maybe I'll give you like a 30-second sneak preview of what I'm going to say for 5 minutes on November 2nd, because you shouldn't have to like come back and run 2 errands. I think we are kind of very naturally built for yes or no questions. And thinking probabilistically is, I think, a very mentally healthy hedge against that. But there's no question that certainly as regards COVID, which we're going to be talking about next week, people want to know what's safe and what's not safe. It's very natural. I get that. At the same time, that kind of binary division, there's no way to make that accurate. There's no way to make that capture anything like what's actually going on in a pandemic situation. You have to talk about probabilities. You have to talk about, it's not if you do this, that will happen. It's if you do this, this becomes more likely to happen, and this other thing becomes more less likely to happen. And I think that's just like an irreducible randomness that's part of the game. And every attempt to analyze a pandemic that doesn't take that into account is inevitably going to fail.
Hi. So I'm kind of just stuck on this one thing, hoping you can kind of clarify it. And correct me if I'm wrong. The book and what you're talking about is kind of in terms of mathematical subjects like geometry, but a lot of what I'm hearing sounds like stuff I've learned through, statistics and, randomness probability. Can you explain kind of where those two meet or cross over, or how geometry plays a role in this instead of, because I just keep thinking about statistics.
Yeah, I mean, so here's the thing. I mean, we teach math as the sequence of courses, and you get 3 credits for this, 3 credits for that. In fact, all this stuff is connected under the skin, and the boundaries are very thin. So what I would say is we now think of, so Markov, for instance, would not have said, I'm doing geometry. No way. He would have said, I'm doing probability. And I think most people, and I would say the people who work on Markov processes in our department they would say, I'm a probabilist. Like that's what they would say. Nonetheless, it is true that the nature of a Markov process is often to explore a space that has some geometry. And so roughly speaking, I would say anytime you study things and you sort of have in mind a concept of nearness or distance, which things are close to which other things, that's a fundamentally geometric concept. And so, for instance, in this random walk on the space of all assembly maps, you have to have some notion of which assembly maps are similar to which other assembly maps, or else you don't know sort of which ones you can step to, what counts as a small change. And that imposes a kind of geometry on this incredibly huge, untamed space of assembly maps. So that's the way I would say it. It's geometry, but in the book, I certainly use geometry in a much, much, much more general sense than would ever be used in a class called geometry, because it's not just about triangles. I mean, there are triangles in the book. I feel like otherwise it would be like false advertising. And there's definitely people you can look on Amazon, and there's people who are like, not enough triangles. Totally, there's people, I mean, I get it. So I try to defy expectations, and then sometimes people don't like it, which I totally get. Because you're absolutely right that a lot of what's in the book, people would say like, well, I think that's more like some other kind of math. And I'm like, well, it is that too, but I have a very broad idea of what constitutes geometry.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Two questions. One kind of tied to the probability aspect. Like, how would you say the climate change crisis and understanding that ties into the inability to understand probability, talking about applied math? And getting back to the assembly map situation, the second question I have is, could you say more about the mathematical reality underlying the fact that even though it's a 50-50 split statewide, you still end up with a 55-45 split in the assembly? And I have a hunch, I have an intuitive feel, but I'd love to have a professional perspective. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll start with the second question because it's pretty simple. What it comes down to is that, in an assembly district like 77, the one where I live and the one we're all sitting in right now, that district is going to give 85 to 90% of its votes to the Democratic candidate in any election. So that's a huge margin for the Democrat. There is no district in the state that is 85% Republican. That does not exist. And so what you have is all those Democratic voters who, if they were scattered around the state, would create more Democratic districts, are all concentrated right here in the city of Madison, electing one representative. And so that's the fundamental feature of the state's political geography that leads to that bias in that direction. It's as simple as that. But as I said, I think it probably leads on average to about a 5-seat bias, not the 10-seat bias that we get with our gerrymandered map. To your other question, and we almost have to be out of here in like 3 minutes, so I'm going to answer it quickly. I'll just say that I think it is one of the biggest challenges that people are like, well, it flooded in my city. That doesn't usually happen. How should I think about whether this was caused by climate change? And the question of how causation works when you're talking about events that are probabilistic, that might happen or might not. It's a hard question, as much philosophy as math. I don't have a great answer to it, but we can talk after. Okay.
Hi, I have a totally irreverent question, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but it's about randomness. And I noticed that your hair up on top of your forehead is kind of shaped like Salvador Dali's mustache, and I wonder if that's random.
So you think, because I don't have Salvador Dali as a box in my chart, he's not in the book, but he is. Everything's in my book. So the connection between this book and Salvador Dali is that he is inspired by Charles Hinton, who was one of the first people to try to visualize four-dimensional geometry. Dali has a famous crucifixion painting where the cross, instead of being a cross, is kind of like a model of a hypercube, a sort of thing that looks 3D on the page. But he borrowed this from Charles Hinton, this kind of eccentric 19th century geometer who also invented the word tesseract, which if you read Wrinkle in Time, you know from that book, and which is also the name of a very cool light installation at Olbrich Gardens. You can still go for a week and see their like weird nighttime light show and stand inside the tesseract. And I almost wanted to tell the lady from the gardens who was running it, like, oh, the word tesseract was coined by, and then I was like, no, I can't do it. I've like talked enough about this already. So so I guess maybe I was thinking about Dali because he appears in the book as someone who drew a tesseract in one of his paintings. All right, should we stop there? Because I think I'm supposed to be outside signing books. Now, oh, is it random? I haven't even seen my hair today, so I don't know.